As powerful psychoactive substances, psychotropic drugs are available only through the prescription of a medical doctor. So how did psychiatrists and drug companies succeed in convincing millions of doctors to prescribe them to hundreds of millions of people? Drug companies are anxious to get their products onto the market as soon as possible. This is, after all, a business, and every day can be worth millions. To assure the public and mainstream physicians that their little-tested psychotropics are safe, drug companies spare no expense in getting psychiatrists to stand behind them, and psychiatrists are happy to take the money.
It's really quite an interesting marriage that the drug companies have with the medical profession, and psychiatry primarily is a strong arm of them.
This relationship is born in medical school.
You go to medical school and you learn that drugs are the answer. And then you go into residency and you're told about this whole armamentarium of psychotropic drugs, and if somebody's bipolar, you use this whole group of drugs. If someone's depressed, you use these drugs, and so on. And that is the Bible. And when you're a believer, as psychiatrists are, in the Bible of psychiatry, or in that box called psychiatry, you're not likely to stray unless you begin to think for yourself.
And once out of medical school, many of these true believing psychiatrists are recruited by drug companies and groomed to be spokesmen.
They know then who are the psychiatrists who are most easily influenced, and they can then invest in those doctors, take those doctors to whatever fancy resort to be educated about the latest, newest med, and those people then become the experts. They go and give the talks at the medical dinners, at the fancy restaurants, or at the drug-sponsored symposia at the American Psychiatric Association. They become the teachers in the residency training programs.
Once these so-called key opinion leaders have canvassed the psychiatrists in their area, they then bridge over to mainstream physicians to convince them to prescribe psychotropic drugs.
So you have the psychiatrists coming in now and teaching at an OBGYN convention where they'll give papers there, or they'll, designed to address GPs and teach the GPs how to look for and diagnose these diseases and these illnesses. And again, the psychiatrist they're the ones who are going to know. Like in the medical profession, most of the doctors will say, well, these guys are the specialists in the field. I'm going to listen to how they want me to do this so that I can do it in my own practice, and they'll follow that lead and that influence, all funded by the drug companies.
Indoctrinating physicians begins at medical conferences like these, where government-mandated continuing medical education, or CME, courses are taught.
I'm required once a year to have so many units of postgraduate training, and so I have to go to get my hours by approved training centers that the state recognizes, and those approved training centers are run by the drug companies.
But far from being educational, these conferences are frequently produced by professional medical education firms hired by drug companies. And their psychotropic drug seminars are commonly conducted by drug company paid psychiatrists who can be paid up to $2,500 for a single lecture.
Most of the continual medical education conferences and courses are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies, and so I can guarantee you they're not going to have doctors talking about the risks of using their medications.
The purpose of these conferences is clear. As one of the medical education company's marketing materials reads, whatever combination of audiences you need to motivate in order to exert maximum leverage on the marketplace, we can help you identify them, reach them, and influence their behavior. As a marketing strategy, CME works. In one study, prescription rates of doctors following medical education conferences went up 87% for one drug and 272% for another. Not surprisingly, the pharmaceutical industry now spends up to $1 billion for 371,000 such events every year.
And as long as they're making money, they're going to do everything they can to subsidize medical education, medical journals, postgraduate medical education, including the educating of psychiatrists, to use as many drugs as possible.
And the psychiatrists paid to give these talks make out very well. Case in point, Dr. Charles Nemiroff of Emory University. With deep financial ties to nearly 24 different drug companies, Dr. Nemiroff received $2.8 million in pharmaceutical money from 2000 to 2007. When it was revealed that he had violated federal law by failing to report $1.2 million of this money to his university, he stepped down as chairman of Emory's psychiatry department. But Dr. Nemiroff did not stop at speeches and personal appearances. He was also exposed for having financial ties to a company whose medical device he reviewed favorably in a psychiatric journal he himself edited. On another occasion, he hired 14 Emory University colleagues to write articles for a special supplement of the medical journal celebrating the 5th anniversary of the introduction of the antidepressant efecte. Nemiroff's journal is one example of a very large problem. In one notable case, the New England Journal of Medicine printed an article whose authors had so many financial ties to drug companies that because of space limitations, the journal was forced to list them on its website. Printed out, these financial conflicts covered 3 single-spaced typewritten pages. But it goes further. In many instances, respectable journals have been fooled into publishing studies written by drug company ghostwriters, but falsely credited to prominent psychiatrists who are paid up to $20,000 to put their names on it.
The pharmaceutical industry has set up companies that are educational companies, and they create papers subpoenaed evidence has found these papers where on the top it'll say author ? i.e. they haven't yet decided who to invite to be the author of this scientific paper.
Ghostwriting is very common. As many as 50% of published psychiatric research papers are written by ghostwriters. Sometimes the psychiatrist paid to put his name on the article hardly even looked at it. Take, for example, psychiatrist Dr. David Dunner, who endorsed Paxil as lead author in a 1995 study published in the Journal of European Neuropsychopharmacology, only to later admit he had never reviewed any of the study's actual data, but signed off on the summaries instead. Even the FDA's top official for the review of psychotropic drug clinical trials, psychiatrist Dr. Thomas Loughran, has repeatedly signed his name to articles ghostwritten by drug companies that promote the use of antidepressants and antipsychotics. Psychotropics now labeled by the FDA itself as having high risks of suicidal behavior and premature death. Besides their considerable influence over FDA policymakers, drug companies exert extensive control over psychiatric journals by means of substantial advertising budgets.
Every other page is a pharmaceutical ad that they pay for, and so they are the livelihood of the journals. That's how they get published.
Medical journals are completely supported by the ads from drug companies. Without the ads, the journals would dwindle away.
Doctors look to scientific publications as the objective source. It comes from this university, this research being done by these, highly revered, very well-respected leaders in my industry. If I can't trust them, it's doctor to doctor. I'm not listening to those sales reps. That's different. This is doctor to doctor. I'm listening to the big guy. And, they've taken over that process. In scientific literature now, you just can't trust it.
Today, between 2/3 and 3/4 of all clinical trials published in major journals are funded by drug companies. And to influence prescribers even more effectively, drug companies will give as much as $1 million to journals for reprints of favorable trials they can later use as objective-looking marketing tools. But the pharmaceutical funding of psychiatry goes beyond even this. Until years of pressure finally forced a recent promise to change, the APA's national conference was largely underwritten by drug companies, as were its government lobbying efforts. But old habits die hard. At a recent APA convention, the drug companies were there, handing out food and giving psychiatrists promotional lectures called product theaters.
and they get the vast majority of their funding for their associations, for their meetings, for everything from the pharmaceutical industry. So promoting pharmaceuticals is basically the only options that they have.
With psychiatrists already enthusiastically spreading the pharmaceutical gospel to the rest of the medical field, drug companies also attack prescribing physicians on another flank, using armies of drug company sales representatives.
We always did a full frontal assault. So we always came in, our product's the best. Our product's the best, our product's the best. Are you gonna write it? Are you gonna write it? Are you gonna write scripts? You know, this was kind of our mentality.
My job and my pay was based solely on my ability to push drugs through my territory. So if I wasn't moving enough prescriptions, if I wasn't moving enough pills through my territory, I was at risk of being fired, and on a lesser level, you know, I wasn't making the bonus money.
The bottom line for you was it was a business, you got paid, and you had to get as many prescriptions as you needed. That doctor to write, and you did it however you could.
One way to get people onto psychotropic drugs is through free samples. These are not provided by psychotropic drug makers out of a sense of charity. They are intended to get the patient onto a drug regimen he cannot get off of.
Samples sitting on a shelf encourages a doctor to give that drug away and then to write an accompanying prescription for that, which will be later filled at the pharmacy.
And that's what doctors wanted, to be able to not only have the samples, but give them to their friends, their family, lots to the patients, because they know if they gave the samples, you had a higher incidence of being able to prescribe. The doctors would prescribe your product.
You're getting the physician comfortable with the drug, and you're getting the consumer comfortable with the drug. So let's say when the trial's over and the free drug's gone for the trial, what's the doctor going to do? Is he going to write a prescription of another product? Not if the patient's doing fine. You never want to rock the boat.
The industry and the companies fully understand that if you can get those drug samples into a doctor's hand, you're going to be able to get prescriptions out of that doctor.
They're actually a very effective marketing tool, and there's quite a large percentage of the marketing budget that goes into the distribution of samples.
In 2003, pharmaceutical sales reps handed out $16.4 million worth of free samples. And to sell them even more easily, sales reps have another hidden weapon: prescribing information bought from pharmacies by prescription tracking companies.
You'd get a list with like Dr. XYZ, Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, Celexa, and it would tell you how many scripts, give or take, let's say 10, per month or per week, that physician was writing of those products.
So we knew everything about our doctors, which ones were the most valuable, which ones to spend the most time on, and what we needed to do, and where their weak spots were.
So it was very valuable in that you frequently, as the sales rep, knew better what the doctor was actually doing than the doctor did himself, because he wasn't tracking his own prescriptions.
The drug industry now spends $22 billion a year marketing to doctors to increase prescriptions, an astonishing 90% of its marketing budget. And this investment has paid off. Today, psychotropic drugs are a multi-billion-dollar business, with over 2/3 prescribed by general physicians. But psychiatrists are the ones at the forefront, spreading the word. And when the use of psychotropic drugs is questioned or gets bad publicity, paid psychiatric opinion leaders deflect attacks and discredit critics. Or they may simply use their position to make the problem all go away. Case in point, psychiatrist Dr. Daniel Casey, chairman of the first FDA advisory committee that met in 1991 to decide if a warning label about increased risk of suicide should be added to the label of Prozac. At the hearing, family member after family member came forward to show how Prozac had damaged their children and loved ones. In the end, however, Dr. Casey and his colleagues voted against the label, citing a lack of evidence. But what many at the hearing did not know is that 5 people sitting on that 9-member panel had significant financial ties to drug companies. Casey himself became chairman of an FDA advisory panel that voted to approve another antidepressant, Zoloft, later that same year, and soon became one of Zoloft's most sought-after speakers. But the corruption goes beyond even psychiatrists at the FDA. Directors of major psychiatric institutions are likewise paid handsomely by pharmaceutical companies, such as the deputy director of the New York Psychiatric Institute, who one year received $140,000. Even government agencies are not immune from conflict of interest. In 2006, the state of Texas sued drug maker Janssen for flying the state's own mental health officials to other states throughout the nation to promote its drug Risperdal. Included were perks, travel expenses, and speaking fees. Even at the federal level, the chief of geriatric psychiatry at the U.S. National Institute of Mental Health was convicted that same year for accepting and failing to disclose over $250,000 from drug companies in exchange for consultations, retainer fees, and travel expenses. The result of these pharmaceutically paid doctor education campaigns is an explosion in psychotropic drug prescription, not just written by doctors, but by many others.
I know some practitioners start people on drugs, on the antidepressants. There's unfortunately a nurse practitioner that does it, and she's not supposed to. It's not in her protocol. Another nurse practitioner I work with has told me that she keeps doing it.
It's gotten to the point where you have nurse practitioners, physician's assistants. There are times when that child doesn't even see a doctor. And we're seeing these prescriptions written for, and at best, the doctor may sign off on the bottom of that prescription.
Medical professionals worldwide are handing out psychotropic drugs with seemingly few qualms because they have been assured that they are safe and necessary by the experts in the field, psychiatrists.
The psychiatric community is completely responsible for the widespread use of psychotropic drugs. They're the ones writing the scripts to the large extent, and they're the ones that are proclaiming their supposed beneficial effects, and I think they're sketchy, the evidence isn't good, and the side effects are horrible.
The psychiatrists are the facilitator of the diseases, and therefore the prescriptions.
Today, even official psychiatric organizations do not contest that the partnership between psychiatry and pharmaceutical companies in promoting psychotropic drugs to doctors is significant and almost impossible to avoid. But early on, this partnership realized that promoting to doctors was not enough. How could they reach their target demographic, the end user, and drive them into doctors' offices to demand these drugs? In the mid-1970s, Henry Gadsden, head of Merck, one of the world's largest drug corporations, told Fortune magazine that he wanted his company to be more like chewing gum maker Wrigley's and sell to everyone, even healthy people. Has Gadsden's dream come true? Is marketing now driving the machinery of one of the most profitable industries on earth? Are psychotropic drugs really being marketed like chewing gum? Psychotropic drugs are marketed on two fronts. The first is through sales campaigns aimed at doctors, psychiatrists, and other prescribers. And on a second flank, the drugs are promoted heavily to consumers, you. Until recently, however, it was rare to see a drug advertisement on television because, by law, drug companies had to list all side effects, a list far too long for a 30 or 60-second spot. But in 1997, drug company lobbyists pressured the U.S. Congress to relax this rule and allow them to mention only some of the side effects. With this simple change, advertising psychotropic drugs on American television suddenly became possible. And this opened the floodgates to a torrent of advertising, which soared from $595 million a year in 1996 to $4.7 billion today, an increase of almost 700%.
The directed consumer advertising on television, they don't give that message that in order to be healthy, you need to be off drugs. They don't give you that message. They give you the message that, oh, you have a problem, you have an issue, here's the drug that'll fix you.
And a lot of money is driving this message home. The average American television viewer now sees as many as 16 hours of drug advertising a year.
The pharmaceutical industry reaches right into our living room on a daily basis and tries to convince us that we have this problem that they can solve with a pill. That's dangerous.
If you watch any primetime TV, if you watch any primetime news, you're going to get multiple advertisements for whatever the current med is of choice.
On television, there are ads now that say, you have got this condition and you're feeling miserable. Ask your doctor to give you this pill. Take this pill, it's over the counter. We're being taught, our society really pushes the idea of quick, simple answers.
Ask your doctor if Abilify is right for you.
Ask your doctor about Cymbalta.
Talk to your doctor about Zoloft.
Ask your doctor about Prestige.
Ask your doctor if it's
Talk to your doctor about the risks and benefits of adding Abilify.
If you can convince somebody that they've got a medical or biological problem, that the only thing that solves it is a pill, stands to reason you're going to sell more pills.
To see how effective this Ask Your Doctor marketing strategy is, one study sponsored by the National Institute of Mental Health in 2005 sent trained actors into doctors and psychiatrists' offices, claiming to be depressed and asking for a specific antidepressant. 50% of them received a prescription for the very drug they requested. And even if the actor did not ask for any psychotropic drug at all, he was given a prescription a third of the time.
The doctors feel tremendously pressured to please the patient, to prescribe what the patient is asking for. Nobody likes being labeled as the doc who didn't do anything for me.
The doctor is a businessman, and he knows that if he doesn't fulfill that patient's request, there's a probability that that patient will go elsewhere because he'll find somebody that's willing to prescribe that drug.
It should be the doctor's choice. It should be the doctor's evaluation driving the use of any medication. It shouldn't be giving a patient the opportunity to see something on TV and come in and ask for it by name, because doctors then are immediately put in a situation where they feel pressured to pull out the prescription pad, whereas they should have come to that conclusion based on their actual clinical data.
But getting the patient to walk in and demand psychotropic drugs for non-existent diseases has taken that power out of doctors' hands. And this has been done through psychiatric drug marketing campaigns that fill the coffers of media outlets. Drug advertising on television, for example, accounts for 55% of the pharmaceutical industry's direct-to-consumer advertising budget. And estimates show that if this television advertising were ever banned, prescription sales in the United States alone would plummet by $10 billion. Magazines and other print media also depend on pharmaceutical companies for much of their advertising dollars, over $1.8 billion a year. But is this a good thing? Do such massive amounts of ad revenue taint what we see in the media?
You know, obviously the advertising pays for the television programs. So the real money is in the advertising, not in the television program. So that's where the money is. I don't know of too many magazines that want to run huge advertisements blasting the drug companies that are paying for the magazine on the next page. They're going to take a lot of heat, and people are going to pull their ads if they start doing that. So again, you have a huge conflict of interest at play with the mass media.
This partnership between the pharmaceutical industry and the media also extends to public service announcements promoting psychiatric disease.
Americans living with schizophrenia.
Kids with ADHD or you have postpartum depression. Still dealing with depression? It could be your time for change.
Psychiatrists are featured promoting drugs in video news releases, which look just like TV news reports, but are, in reality, drug company-produced marketing spots. On news interviews, the experts furnished come from approved drug company speakers bureaus, and these psychiatrists rarely disclose their financial ties. As a result, mental health care segments in the media rarely deviate from the psychiatric party line. Psychotropic drugs are mentioned in movies and television, such as Prozac on the TV series The Sopranos, and Zoloft, a product placement in the film The Sixth Sense. This mountain of marketing is not confined to broadcast media only. Print, too, is inundated with drug propaganda, masquerading as news and information.
All you have to do is look at any
accepted magazine in America today, whether it be on even a woman's journal or men's journal, there's always some type of pharmaceutical product that's being focused. And they've gone so far as to give away free samples. All you have to do is write in this coupon.
And the psychiatric drug message has even infiltrated the taxpayer-supported public radio. For instance, psychiatrist Frederick Goodwin hosted a talk show for years where he championed the use of psychotropic drugs. As we'll be hearing today, Dr. Goodwin assured his listeners, modern treatments, mood stabilizers in particular, have been proven both safe and effective in bipolar children. What he did not say was that he would be paid $2,500 by pharmaceutical company GlaxoSmithKline to give a lecture that very night promoting their mood stabilizer drug, Lamictal. And there was more. The very week that Dr. Goodwin told radio audiences that there is no credible scientific evidence linking antidepressants to violence or to suicide, he raked in $20,000 from Glaxo, which had already admitted that it had suppressed studies revealing that its antidepressant Paxil increased the risk of suicide. Further investigation revealed that Goodwin had failed to report more than $1.3 million in drug company income. Might this level of conflict of interest be preventing the mainstream media from revealing the full truth about psychiatric drugs?
As long as we have direct-to-consumer advertising and the marketing dollars the pharmaceutical companies put into it, you will not hear a companion story or any information about a school shooter or a person who went to their work and killed all their family members and friends. You will never hear whether or not they were on a medication. What you will hear is how depressed they were. And you'll have consultant after consultant and psychiatrist after psychiatrist coming up and being interviewed to discuss how mentally screwed up this person was and how they weren't doing their treatment the way they were supposed to, or they didn't seek treatment when they should have.
This story has protected psychiatrists and their drugs for decades. To understand why one hears it so often, one need look no further than the bottom line. As parts of large corporate giants, today's media companies are in the business of making money. And to their CEOs, keeping stock prices high is part of their job description. And when pharmaceutical advertising money is your lifeblood, there is little chance you will rock the boat. With traditional sources so compromised, one might wonder if the information they're getting on psychotropic drugs really is the whole story. But what about the internet? Well, psychiatrists and drug companies are already pushing psychotropic drugs in cyberspace too, with very few restrictions.
If a patient goes online and looks up a drug and puts in a drug's name, and there'll be a bunch of sites that come up, many of those sites will be funded by the drug companies, but you won't be able to tell from the site. You'd have to, dig up, if at all. You may have no idea that that site was funded at all by the drug company. And especially those ones like Ask a Doctor, those are definitely drug company driven.
Through every communication outlet they can influence, psychiatrists and drug companies team up to drum out one single relentless message. You are sick. We've got the answer. And ask your doctor. Women are a special target for these campaigns, both through magazines and daytime talk shows. This appears to be working, with almost 2/3 of all psychotropic drugs taken by women.
We don't get the full truth because the media is owned by Big Pharma. You just turn on your radio or open your newspaper and you find ads. They're not going to bite the hand that feeds them. They don't tell the truth.
It's a vicious cycle because the more these drugs are marketed, the more people want to take them. The more money goes to pharma to market more drugs.
But despite their success, psychiatrists and the drug companies they work for are not satisfied only with media campaigns. So their next strategy is, how do you convince even more people to take psychotropic drugs, all the while remaining a hidden influence? Billions are spent every year by drug companies to advertise their latest drug. These efforts are obvious. But are there hidden ways that psychiatrists and drug companies can get you to ask your doctor without your even knowing it? It might seem impossible that an appetite for psychotropic drugs could be created without one's even being aware of it. Could this possibly be true? Well, if you know what to look for, you will find drug marketing campaigns practically everywhere. In hospitals, programs promoting psychotropics air over closed-circuit television networks like the Patient Channel. You can find them in children's books such as Brandon and the Bipolar Bear, where a little boy is told that his feelings are caused by chemicals in his brain that can be controlled with good medicine. There are mental health awareness programs touring college campuses to promote mental health checkups. Another hidden promotion lured high school girls to a conference on eating disorders to pitch them Zoloft. Where do these campaigns come from? Many of them come from industry-funded front groups, operated by psychiatrists, but posing as compassionate patient support groups.
A group that's focused on people who get depressed, or, these support groups. Those are all also funded by and driven by, in large part, the drug companies.
The fact that they're being, highly funded by the drug companies puts into question, the information that they're providing.
In fact, a recent global survey estimates that 2/3 of all patient advocacy groups depend on drug companies or device manufacturers for at least some of their income. Through media interviews, public service announcements, and promotional events, psychiatric front groups preach the message that at least 1/4 of everyone on Earth is mentally ill. You could be too, and there is nothing you can do about it short of taking psychotropics for the rest of your life. And of all the programs they use to get people onto these drugs, one of the most successful is the benevolent-sounding mental health screening campaign. But it all begins with psychiatrists and their very broad DSM-based screening questionnaires that cover common life situations such as sadness, nervousness, and occasional loneliness.
Because the symptoms are so subjective and the way they decide to describe it, everybody's got depression. So then they started targeting the kids and doing this at schools, and they implemented it through the school process, coming to the schools and having depression screening days.
People would come in and they'd fill out these questionnaires and, oh yeah, you've got it. Brought in quite a few new customers.
But with statistics proving that more than 1/4 of those screened at thousands of screening sites later start taking antidepressants, it's hard to see screening as anything other than a spectacular marketing opportunity. One such front group, Screening for Mental Health Incorporated, sponsors national campaigns such as National Depression Screening Day, which uses simple quizzes to screen people for mental illness. But what is not revealed is that Screening for Mental Health has taken in a total of almost $5 million from at least 7 different drug companies, all makers of psychotropic drugs given to children. Of all demographics, these mental health screening companies especially target teenagers. Teen Screen is the biggest such screening program in the world, a U.S. national program targeting high school students under the guise of suicide prevention. Teen Screen was developed by Dr. David Schaffer, a psychiatrist with heavy ties to the drug industry.
Teen Screen is a series of questions that take about 10 minutes for kids to answer. It's targeted at high school kids.
On the Teen Screen case, it asks, do you sometimes feel like other people have an easier life, or, do sometimes you feel bad about yourself and other times you feel good about yourself? Well, given where you are in that particular day and what's happened, you're going to answer that differently.
Once this test comes back that the child answered it based on how his emotions were at that very moment, that information gets passed back to the school, possibly the guidance counselor, adjustment counselor, or the school counselor herself, and that child is then referred on to mental health agency.
And studies now show that once in front of a psychiatrist, 9 out of 10 children are prescribed a psychotropic drug. Using alarming language and misleading statistics, Teen Screen attempts to frighten parents, fearful that their child may be suicidal. But a closer look reveals that this is not a suicide prevention program at all, but a drug marketing campaign. And this marketing and its wide diagnostic net creates a huge rate of what are known as false positives. By Schaffer's own admission, 84% of all students taking the Teen Screen test were falsely labeled as depressed or suicidal. Predictably, Teen Screen is viewed with suspicion by many parents. To get around this, Teen Screen personnel have offered school children such enticements as movie coupons or free pizza to motivate them to get their parent's signature on the consent form. To eliminate parental objection altogether, Teen Screen has even instituted a passive consent policy, whereby if the parent does not formally object in writing, the child is assumed to have gotten permission and is then screened.
Typically, the permission slip that comes home is a permission slip that if you don't sign it, they will give the children the screening anyway.
And for many who do complete the screening questionnaire, the results can be devastating. In Colorado, Teen Screen labeled over half of all school children as at risk for suicide, in spite of a government-documented teen suicide rate of less than 1 in 10,000. Far fewer odds than being struck by lightning. In fact, in the last decade, the American teen suicide rate has not risen, but has actually fallen by 25%.
There's no data that supports that doing something like a teen screen is actually going to reduce suicides. They themselves have indicated that the numbers are so small, the suicide rate is so small, that you can't really get an accurate read on whether it works or not.
On top of this, there is now evidence that, far from preventing suicide, screening programs actually cause it. The chair of the National Institute of Mental Health Research Consortium concluded participants were more likely to consider suicide a solution to a problem after the program than before the program. And research has shown that once put on psychotropic drugs, children are more likely not just to consider suicide, but to actually follow through.
That you may have more people that are so distraught by the way they are when they're under the influence of the drug that they do commit suicide. And I think it's entirely possible that they're not, instead of saving lives, they're going to be losing lives to suicide.
With no evidence of effectiveness on one hand and a huge downside on the other, Teen Screen is still being run in 43 states at over 500 sites. But it is not the only screening program aimed at children. The Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System administers a 35-minute test in at least 45 states. Yet another, Signs of Suicide Incorporated, has screened thousands of children at 3,500 schools across the United States. They too are heavily backed by pharmaceutical money. And so far, for psychiatrists and drug companies, it has been a great investment.
Throwing out a net in doing a typical teen screen or any type of mass assessment, we now have increased our client population tenfold by kids who need to be either seen by a therapist and or seen by a psychiatrist.
The internet is another rich source of new prospects. Take, for example, the Patient Health Questionnaire, a 16-item checklist that allows anyone to diagnose himself with depression within 8 minutes. One of the questionnaire's developers was psychiatrist Dr. Robert Spitzer, the architect of DSM-3, and its copyright is owned by Pfizer, the world's largest pharmaceutical company, and maker of the antidepressant Zoloft. There is also a 2-question version that can take less than a minute to advise you to ask your doctor. Online screening questionnaires abound, testing such potential psychiatric disease categories as bipolar disorder, ADHD, narcissism, self-esteem problems, eating disorders, and sex addiction.
We all have ups and downs because that's what normal life is. If you administer the screening on those times where you have down, you're going to be labeled as having a mental health issue. Where if you took the same screening later, you may not be, but you've already been labeled that way. And that's the danger of that.
And labels last a lifetime. So far, screening campaigns have been limited to those willing to participate. But what if the screenings are no longer voluntary? Will this lead to increased drugging? Psychiatrists insist that a mental health screening would be beneficial for everyone. But is this true? And what are the risks? In 2003, a presidential advisory group known as the New Freedom Commission on Mental Health issued a comprehensive program that laid out its strategy for screening major segments of American society for signs of mental illness. Some of their goals included programs creating early detection of mental illness, enlarging the role of schools in diagnosing and treating mental problems, and expanding the use of mental health screening beyond the psychiatrist's couch and into the offices of primary care physicians.
It's going to screen the population for mental health, the whole population. They're going to do it by stages, starting with school children, of course.
So far, mandatory mental health screening is not yet a reality, except for a few small segments of society. One of them consists of the most powerless and disenfranchised of them all, foster children.
A child goes into foster care, they label the child with some kind of a psychological problem. The child is immediately sent to therapy. Well, the therapist will say, well, I believe the child needs to be on something. So they recommend that the child see a psychiatrist to have the drug administered.
Out of the 60, 65 families that I see, easily 90% of the kids they have the mental health diagnosis to begin with. If they get it from a psychiatrist, it almost always comes with meds. And I think that we see identified as at-risk kids in the community, and we see some of the most intense situations. And a lot of them are on 4 or 5 different meds.
I've seen children that the day they're taken out of their parents' custody and placed into state custody, actually seem happy, healthy, vibrant, energetic. And then, 2 months later, after they've begun taking these medications, they are very slow. They are zombie-like, is the best way to describe it.
Today, all children entering Texas's foster care system receive mental health screening. The result? 60% of the state's foster child population is diagnosed and put on at least one psychotropic drug, including some children as young as 3 years old. And it is worse in other states. In Massachusetts, for example, 2/3 of children in state care are being treated for mental illness. Nationally, foster children are being drugged at over triple the rate of children in the general population, such as in the case of 7-year-old foster child Gabriel Myers on 2 powerful psychotropic drugs, one carrying an FDA warning for causing suicidal thoughts in children when he hanged himself with a shower hose. Another market segment is active duty soldiers who are routinely screened at military clinics, labeled with a mental disorder, and given powerful and potentially violence-inducing drugs.
Iraq wasn't like Vietnam. There weren't illegal drugs everywhere. But there were drugs everywhere because, every guy on post, they knew all they needed to do was go down and see the combat stress unit, the shrink, and he was the drug dealer on post for us.
Almost everybody that saw the body or experienced the event were put on some sort of psychotropic medication.
Some bases where my friends were at, my fellow veterans were at, everyone, the whole platoon was on drugs.
I would say about 75% of active duty military is addicted to some type of psychotropic drug.
You could walk around a military barracks and you ask someone for some Prozac and somebody got some Prozac or some Xanax or some Zoloft.
I've got friends who were in the Army with me who are now dependent on Zoloft and psychotropic drugs just because they got used to it in Iraq and they didn't ever want to get off it, and now they're dependent on it and addicted to it.
We have huge numbers of military people on antidepressants, and instead of the suicide rate going down, which you'd expect if the drugs were effective, the suicide rate is going up.
This last January, we had more soldiers commit suicide than we had die in combat. And what's not being brought out much yet is the fact that the large majority of these soldiers were on these drugs. We're drugging the military at a rate we've never, ever seen before.
And this is just the beginning. Military mental health screening programs are planned for 43 clinics in 15 bases throughout the United States, Germany, and Italy. Studies reveal that as many as 12% of those serving in Iraq and 17% in Afghanistan are on some type of antidepressant or sleeping pill. A total of 20,000 service members. But this number pales in comparison to the number of pregnant or postnatal women that could be drugged should mandatory psychiatric screening laws for them come to pass.
And when a woman is pregnant, right during the pregnancy, specifically right afterwards, her hormones are changing and sometimes raging. And to screen them and call it mental illness, if they have any type of emotional issues in any way, shape, or form, is utterly ludicrous.
Even without laws mandating it, expectant mothers may be screened for mental illness and not even know it. Here are some women interviewed coming out of their doctor's offices.
Have you ever been screened for mental illness?
I have not been screened for mental illness.
I know I've never been screened for any mental illness. I don't remember any pre-screening. I have not been. No. No. Have you ever been screened for any mental illness?
No, I have not been screened for any mental illness.
Did your OB/GYN or gynecologist have you fill out a questionnaire that contains psychological questions?
Yes, my OB/GYN did give me a questionnaire that has psychological questions.
I've never been screened for mental illness. Yes, I would say the first time I went to see my OB/GYN, I did fill out questionnaires about even family medical history, my medical history, my mental state.
I've not been screened for any mental illness or depression. I took a questionnaire at my 6-week checkup, and it basically asked me about if I was crying, if I felt depressed.
Yeah, it was a questionnaire about depression. If you're depressed, or if you had any history of depression.
Are you happy with your normal day? Are you happy about being pregnant?
Have you ever hurt yourself? Are you happy? If I feel like hurting someone, if I was angry.
Do mental illness run in your family?
You know, it was very noticeable to me after the pregnancy that they're actually fishing for the postpartum depression.
When I was pregnant with my daughter, before I had her, I had to take postpartum depression medicine from my 7th month on to my 9th month.
And where is this screening leading? To programs like a little-known drugging scheme originally formulated in Texas in 1995 called the Texas Medication Algorithm Project, or TMAP.
TMAP is a program that was originated starting in the 90s, a collaborative group of doctors from University of Texas and the Texas Department of Mental Health and Mental Retardation. And what it was supposed to do was come up with the best practice for treating mental illness.
Using research funding from 11 different pharmaceutical companies, this panel, dominated by psychiatrists, created a step-by-step flowchart that requires the prescribing of only the latest and most expensive psychiatric drugs for patients with mental problems. And if one psychotropic didn't work, doctors were obligated to try another expensive one. And if none worked, the next step would be electric shock treatment. But those running TMAP were hiding a major conflict of interest.
They didn't disclose that the researchers that were all involved in creating this, almost every single one of them had financial relationships with the pharmaceutical companies.
But Texas isn't the only state with problems of corruption. Alan Jones was an investigator in the office of the Pennsylvania Inspector General.
I learned that these monies were all coming in to the state to support and to promote a program called TMAP, the Texas Medication Algorithm Project. And so my concern was piqued very quickly that there was at least one state official who might be inappropriately receiving and dispersing monies from drug companies. They called it PenMap, but it was based entirely on the TMAP model. Also very quickly, I learned that there were other state employees who were serving on advisory boards financed through various pharmaceutical companies, and other state employees who were accepting honorariums personally, directly, from drug companies for speaking in their state capacities or official capacities. That's a felony in Pennsylvania. I saw there was a much bigger picture and attempted to surface that bigger picture and was consistently told to back off. I was told that drug companies write checks to politicians on both sides of the aisle. Back off. You will not expand this investigation into the drug companies. Continue to press the investigation, much of it on my own time at this point. I became increasingly alarmed that all of the drugs recommended by the TMAP program were exclusively the new patented atypical antipsychotics for schizophrenia and all of the brand new patented SSRI antidepressants. None of it added up. When it became obvious to me that my investigation was not going to be permitted to continue, and it became obvious to the Inspector General's office that I was not going to stop, I was removed from lead investigator on the case. They threatened me with loss of career, with loss of job, with loss of reputation, essentially.
Despite the investigation resulting in the conviction of Pennsylvania's chief pharmacist, TMAP and offshoots like PenMap spread throughout the country, generating billions of dollars in drug sales. But the psychiatric gravy train comes at great public cost. In 2001, TMAP and its children's equivalent CMAP bankrupted the Texas Medicaid program and the state's mental health and prison systems. So, what do we see in the final picture? A government-run, taxpayer-funded mental health screening program wherein every person judged by psychiatrists to have a mental illness is given powerful, dangerous, and expensive psychotropic drugs. And if they don't work, electroshock treatment.
They're going to start with school children on the New Freedom Initiative. Then they're going to move it to senior citizen nursing homes. Then they're going to move it to, of course, military. And then parents.
By the time you're 18, you've been screened in utero when you were an infant. You were screened as an infant when you first came out. You were screened in your daycare. You were screened then at school. You were screened at the pediatrician's office. You're screened in high school. You're screened over and over again.
And to sit there and pass laws requiring that people be screened and drugged based on screening under state law or federal law is really, it's criminal. It should not be done.
They're marketing this madness all over this country, and we are actually becoming an example for the rest of the world. So we're, again, the poster child, if you will, and so the rest of the world's spending more and more on drugs.
I don't know that there was ever a time in the history of the world where people have been drugged to the extent of what we're seeing today.
The reality is, if you look at the overall picture, I don't see these drugs helping us make a better society. We see it in the military, we see it in our children, we see it in the schools. These drugs are not working to make a better society.
And with hidden mental illness marketing campaigns at full tilt, what happens to patients once diagnosed and delivered into the psychotropic drugging machine? If drugs are being sold as safe and effective by psychiatrists and drug companies, why is it that we are seeing an alarming increase in consumer-reported adverse side effects? What are psychiatrists not telling us? All drugs create biological changes in the human body. In mainstream medicine, those changes that are intended are called main effects. Those that aren't are called side effects. No drug is without effects, side or otherwise. But with psychiatric drugs targeting delicate brain processes, all effects, even main effects, can be hazardous, unpredictable, and sometimes irreversible.
All these medications that are apparently supposed to act as a magic pill, they're finding they all of them have side effects that, could put the patient in harm's way just as well as it could help them.
So, just what are these drugs doing, and how do they work? To find out, you should be able to locate much of this information in the drug's package insert, or PI. Contained in this insert is the mechanism of action, the drug maker's explanation for how the drug works on the body. Take, for example, antibiotics, drugs used for over 50 years as a cure for infectious diseases such as tetanus, tuberculosis, and strep throat. Its mechanism of action is well known. Antibiotics prevent the cellular activity of bacteria, thus inhibiting its growth or killing it altogether. But with psychotropics, drug makers say on their own package insert that their mechanism of action is unknown.
Most of the medications that are given to clients, whether they're SSRI medications or they're antipsychotics, a lot of the pharmacology of these medications, they don't even know how they work in the first place.
But it has been noted that there is one primary side effect of psychotropics that is common to all.
Most medication and psychotropic medication, I've noticed, tends to flatten things, so that while you're decreasing the depression, you're also decreasing the joy. And so you're minimizing what it means to be human in the service of avoiding dealing with a problem.
They can't connect to the world around them. They feel like there's no feeling, which is, you know, you should have some feeling there.
All that's doing is really numbing them down, and they're not doing the work that they need to do to resolve that issue that's going on somewhere internally.
But the numbing of emotions is not the only way psychotropic drugs affect the user. Each of the 5 main classes of psychotropics has side effects of its own. Typical antipsychotics, such as thorazine, are powerful chemicals originally designed to shut down the central nervous systems of mental hospital inmates. They are now mainly used on people with serious mental problems, and they can cause feelings of helplessness, deterioration of the mind, neurological damage, dementia, trembling, twitching, and damage to internal organs, to name a few. Anti-anxiety drugs such as Valium and Xanax are prescribed for nervousness, anxiety, and panic disorders. They can cause patients dissociation, cognitive impairment, increased aggression, fatigue, hallucination, and acute amnesia.
They've got foggy thinking. They're bloated. They have weight gain. They're now diabetic. It's one symptom after another, all caused from the drugs that they're taking, and they don't realize it.
Stimulant drugs like Ritalin, Adderall, and Concerta are mainly used for people with so-called attention problems, such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. These drugs are very addictive and can result in stunted growth, weight loss, manic behavior, heart palpitations, neurological tics, cardiac arrhythmia, gross brain shrinkage and malfunction, anxiety, insomnia, violent behavior, and even sudden death. Ritalin, a stimulant commonly prescribed to children, acts on the body in a very similar way to cocaine, but is far more potent. And recent studies show that it can cause permanent changes in children's developing brains.
So you're going to have problems, and it is shown that some of these medications, particularly the stimulants that they're giving, like Ritalin and Concerta, all the ADHD medications actually shrink brain tissue.
They know that these psychiatric drugs destroy cells, destroy brain cells, shrink brain tissue. How can that possibly ever benefit anyone? It can't. That's the simplicity. It's not possible.
Antidepressants are a 4th class of psychotropic drug. As their name suggests, they are used to treat depression and mood disorders. The list of side effects includes blurred vision, dry mouth, low blood pressure, internal bleeding, weight gain, sleep disturbance, seizures, impaired cardiac function, and psychosis.
Most common thing that I see is the sexual dysfunction. So women having a hard time reaching orgasm or just finding that their libido is lower. And I see that with men as well. And the second most common thing I see is weight gain. I have to say it is not terribly uncommon to see a 40-pound weight gain with antidepressants.
One study found that Paxil, a leading antidepressant, increases the risk of breast cancer in women by 7 times. Perhaps riskiest of all is the drugging of pregnant or postnatal women with antidepressants for depression.
When the mother takes the drugs, the psychiatric drugs, or any type of drug in that like an antidepressant or anti-anxiety or an antipsychotic drug, that's going to affect the baby as well as the mother, not just the mom, because the baby's going to get it straight through the umbilical cord, through the bloodstream.
The drugging of pregnant women has led to a 20 to 30% hazard of preterm birth, brain damage, and lower fetal age at delivery, and nearly triples the risk of severe birth defects.
And the antidepressants have been shown to cause something called PPHN, which is a heart problem in newborns. And I think it's criminal to be giving medications to women knowing that their babies are going to be at risk.
When mom takes Paxil, she can have a baby born with sometimes they have the limbs are missing. It's called limb reduction. They can have cleft lip. They can have serious heart defects, missing chambers, or the arteries in the wrong place, and also can be born with the organs growing outside of the body.
And these are just a few of the many, many side effects of psychotropic drugs. Among the top 3 best-selling antidepressant drugs, called SSRIs, there are 1,817 possible side effects associated with Prozac, 2,194 with Zoloft, and 2,497 with Paxil. Interestingly, among these is the worsening of the exact same symptoms the drugs claim to address.
They cause depression. They cause suicidal tendencies and ideologies. So they cause a lot of the very exact symptoms that they're supposed to be correcting.
They're being treated for depression with a product that's going to create depression. They're treating for a psychosis with something that's actually going to create or has the potential of creating a psychosis.
Atypical antipsychotics, one of the newest classes of psychotropic drugs, are used mainly on adults and children diagnosed with bipolar disorder. They are also known as mood stabilizers. Though launched with storied claims as miracle drugs with little or no side effects, atypical antipsychotics have recently been exposed as creating severe weight gain, diabetes, coronary heart disease, acutely irregular muscle movement, pancreatitis, and delirium. Though the new antipsychotics were originally approved only to treat schizophrenic adults, over a 7-year period, prescriptions for children jumped 5-fold to an estimated 2.5 million prescriptions. And this drugging is coming with serious consequences.
You know, I've seen kids who have had significant weight gain on some of the antipsychotics, where they were pre-diabetic. You know, they've had, changes in some of their cardiovascular functioning. So there are potentials to really damage the child's health.
When you get drugs that you're giving to kids that we know cause extreme weight gain and attack the liver, attack the kidney, that have long-term results, these children that we're giving them today, this medication, we may be doing, kidney dialysis for in 10, 15 years.
And it is not only children that can be affected. It has been estimated that psychotropic drugs are to blame for over 16,000 traffic accidents every year in the United States. And this study only looked at drivers 65 and older. And what happens when these unwanted side effects surface? Usually, the psychiatrist will prescribe yet another drug.
It's called polypharmacy. It's just, adding additional, if the first drug doesn't work, you add a second drug. If you have an adverse side effect from a drug, then you add another drug to deal with the adverse side effect.
And then let's say they start an antidepressant and now they can't sleep. So in order to counteract that, they'll be given a sleeping pill. Then a tolerance builds up. So they might now need another drug because they're now at a tolerance level of the first drug that it's no longer creating the, quote, expected or helpful result.
It's not uncommon to see people 5, 6, 8, 9, psychotropic drugs. And there's absolutely not a shred of research that supports that these drugs can be used safely and effectively in combination.
Consider tardive dyskinesia, a movement disorder entirely caused by psychotropic drugs. For 20 years, beginning in the 50s, psychiatrists failed to inform patients about the link between tardive dyskinesia and antipsychotics, such as Thorazine and Haldol. By the time psychiatrists admitted the truth about their pills, thousands had been permanently crippled. Even today, tardive dyskinesia has developed in 73,000 older adults, and drug-induced Parkinsonism has appeared in 61,000 more. But this class of psychotropics is far from the exception. Reports are now surfacing that today's atypical antipsychotics and antidepressants, such as Zoloft, are causing widespread tardive dyskinesia, sometimes within months of first use. But psychiatrists and drug companies continue to dispute this damning new evidence and go on prescribing these drugs, even to children. But of all the side effects experienced by users of psychotropic drugs, the most horrendous may be an intense inner agitation and restlessness, known as akathisia.
These drugs can cause something called akathisia, which causes people to become very agitated, and actually a little nuts, you know, a little off balance, and they'll do things that they never would have done before, things that are totally out of character.
This is a normal person without any history of auditory hallucinations, and all of a sudden they'll say there's voices telling them this is the only way to stop the pain, it's the only way is to kill themselves.
Had patients tell me that they never, ever, ever had one single thought about suicide in their entire life until they started on the drug.
An estimated 10 to 25% of SSRI antidepressant users, close to 7 million people in the U.S., experience akathisia. And Psychiatry's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders even admits the connection between psychotropic drugs, akathisia, and suicide. The statistics back this up. The suicide rate of the general population is less than 11 for every 100,000. But for every 100,000 people taking SSRIs, the suicide rate jumps to 718, over 65 times more. And yet, we are told daily by psychiatrists and drug companies that psychotropic drugs actually prevent suicide. So, what are we to believe? One can start with the drug company's own warning letters to doctors, or unpublished data for the antidepressant Effexor, or an analysis of Prozac using the FDA's own statistics, or even a British House of Commons report on Zyprexa. Of course, not everyone commits suicide, but the huge volume of other side effects can be horrendous.
The medication that the psychiatrist prescribed me made me feel awful. Constant headaches, constant nausea, wanting my skin to turn inside out, just feeling like bugs were crawling all over me all the time.
It made me feel like all slow and like sluggish and stuff. Like, and when somebody would ask me something, it would kind of like take a minute, like, what?
These drugs have affected my heart. They have affected my liver.
Weight gain one time, hit like 40 pounds.
These thoughts come over me like I wanted to kill I wanted to really hurt somebody.
It just sucks all the life out of you. So you're like a body, like a machine.
I didn't want to live. I didn't have the desire to live. I felt miserable.
You just can't live, you know, you'd just rather die. Because there's no living when you're hallucinating every day.
I actually tried to commit suicide with my psych meds.
At some point when you realize that you are really just existing, you're not living, at some point you realize you need to take the risk to get off.
But what about those who say psychotropic drugs really did make them feel better? That for them, these are life-saving medications whose benefits exceed their risks. Are psychotropics actually safe and effective for them?
So what ends up happening is that someone feels good for a while, and then very often they have to have their dose increased, and then they feel good for a while, and then they might have to have it increased again, or maybe they'll switch agents. So it's that kind of a story if you're not actually getting to the root of what's going on.
I think the research is pretty clear that then often starts to change, and you start to have a supersensitivity to being depressed, in which case then they become more depressed, and then they're chronically depressed.
And there is ample evidence that if the short-term side effects of psychotropics don't get you, the long-term effects will.
Psychiatric drugs are toxic to the body. They do build up in the body and add to the body's reserve and reservoir of toxins that will suppress the immune system, and the body will try and fight them as foreign objects.
If they're on these medications for years and years and years, I mean, one of the things that we know about adults and some of the, for bipolar and schizophrenia is that they're dying at younger ages. And and these are adults. So if we're starting this you know, medication approach with young kids, you know, what is their life expectancy going to be?
No one's really examined it or is looking at the big picture, which is what's it really do to a society with a proliferation of mood-altering, emotion-altering, or blunting in a society at large.
And I think we're going to really see a huge increase in violence and suicide and a lot of bizarre behaviors that we haven't seen, because for a very short period of time, only in the last 60 years, have we really started, you know, medicating, intoxicating our brains with these incredibly toxic substances.
The very real probability of significant long and short-term side effects should give anyone considering taking psychotropic drugs great pause. But what about those already taking them, who, no matter how hard they try, cannot get off? Psychotropic drugs have long been noted for having a multitude of physical and emotional side effects that many simply cannot live with. But if side effects from psychotropics are so bad, why do some people continue to take them? Psychiatrists, drug companies, and even government agencies are entrusted with the safety of the drugs they put on the marketplace. And while they will reluctantly admit to most side effects of psychotropics, there is one more that they almost never mention.
Every single one of these drugs are addictive, psychologically and or physically addictive.
They change your body's makeup, you change your body how it reacts to things. And so even though people, their psychological state, they may be over their depression, they physically will need that drug still. And so that becomes the complication of getting them off.
I have people come to me on a weekend, they run out of refills, and they say to me, if I don't take this drug, I'm gonna get sick. If I don't take this drug, I'm gonna get sick. We don't talk about psychologically, we don't talk about depression, we don't talk about anxiety. I am going to get sick if I don't take this drug this weekend. It has nothing to do with psychology.
But listen to what some psychiatrists questioned at a recent APA conference had to say about addiction.
How addictive are psychiatric drugs?
They aren't. Only benzodiazepines.
They're not addictive at all. Antidepressants are not generally considered addictive.
SSRIs are not addictive.
Antipsychotics, they don't cause addiction.
Major tranquilizers are all safe as far as addiction is concerned.
The drugs that most of us are using in neuropsychiatry are not addictive at all.
So who's right? To find out, we need look no further than former patients with first-hand experience.
The psychologists and psychiatrists, I went to both. They never told me that they would be addictive. They would cause me to have these thoughts.
For sure, the psychiatric drugs I was on was addicting.
Within six months to 9 months, I was hooked.
Boy, Xanax had a hold of me. I mean, I was going through a bottle of pills every 3 or 4 days.
I lost my job over it. Over a prescription drug that's not supposed to be addictive. Lost my job.
The reality is that it is addicting. It will wreck a person's life.
This conflict on addiction all comes down to a definition of words. Most people think of addiction as an uncontrollable psychological or physical need for a certain substance. But not psychiatrists. They define addiction as the craving of a higher and higher dose of the same drug, while the uncontrollable need to keep taking a drug is categorized only as dependence. This is why psychiatrists will not admit that their drugs are addictive.
In their definition, a very small percentage of people become addicted. The reality is a large percentage of people can't get off these drugs, and they call that dependence. It's all a matter of how they term it.
And when you look at addiction, it could be that their tolerance increases and their needs and wants to use the medications increase, or it could be they simply, once they start on the medication, they're not able to come off of it without help. They try to, and as soon as they try to come off the medications, they start to have symptoms that are unwanted and obviously keep them wanting to take the medications again.
When you explain to them how addictive it is, they are surprised because they're like, well, it's a prescription. So I do believe that a lot of people don't really know how harmful these meds are. They don't view them as dangerous as some of the street drugs.
But many psychotropics have become street drugs, especially the class of drugs given to children diagnosed as having inattention or hyperactivity. Stimulants such as Ritalin, Adderall, and Concerta are so habit-forming that they are listed by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration as Schedule II drugs, highly addictive substances on the same list as morphine and cocaine.
Biochemistry and pharmacology of Ritalin is exactly the same as that of cocaine, except for the speed of onset.
The similarity between Ritalin and cocaine becomes obvious when considering the major problem of stimulant abuse in our schools, where tablets of Ritalin and its chemical cousin Adderall are taken recreationally by kids in schoolyards.
Some of my friends took Ritalin and Adderall just to get high, like that I've known throughout the years. Kids will chop that stuff up with a razor blade. It's pure, man. Pure drug, you know, that's why kids like it. They'd chop it up with a razor blade and snort it.
My cousin Sammy had this Ritalin, and we would eat it, and we'd be able to stay up all night and play video games. It was, your pupils would dilate. It was just outrageous.
Matter of fact, in 8th grade, I got kicked out of school 3 days before it let out for selling Ritalin and actually snorting lines in the back of the classroom. So yes, sir, it definitely caused me some problems there, and I definitely had people buying them from me, yes.
This is no small problem. In 2006, researchers discovered that more than 7 million Americans had misused stimulants, with 75,000 American teenagers and young adults becoming addicted every year. Beyond just addicting its users, stimulants are also well known as gateway drugs that lead to further addiction to such street drugs as cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine.
When you provide drugs in a manner in which most of our children are being provided drugs at an early age in life, only prepares that child to be on more drugs as they get older.
And yet in several recent publications, psychiatrists actually encourage children labeled ADHD to take stimulants to reduce future dependencies on cocaine and other street drugs. But evidence shows that not only is this theory unfounded, but the reverse is true.
When I've spoken to people who are methamphetamine addicts, they said that the drug that they started taking almost consistently was Ritalin.
The longer a child is on Ritalin, the more the likelihood that they may become addicted, whether it's Ritalin or Concerta or Adderall, okay, or a number of other drugs.
Stimulants aren't the only psychotropic drugs carrying a high potential for addiction. Benzodiazepines, for example, are tranquilizers that can become addictive within 14 days. Take, for example, the benzodiazepine Xanax, which after only 5 years on the market was producing 1.5 million addicts every year. And getting off can be very difficult. Symptoms of Xanax withdrawal include shakiness, loss of appetite, muscle cramps, memory and concentration problems, insomnia, agitation, panic, and anxiety.
Some of the psych medicines, particularly the benzodiazepines, are some of the most addictive drugs there are in terms of the persistent withdrawal anxiety that these drugs cause.
I have been in the position of having to withdraw a number of people from benzodiazepines that I didn't put on them, obviously. And it's difficult. It's really difficult.
Prescription benzodiazepines, I think, are much more dangerous and much harder to come off of for the patient than the street drugs are.
But survivors will tell you that benzodiazepines are not the only class of psychotropic drug that is extremely hard to withdraw from.
I had about a 10-year time frame in my life where I abused both street drugs and prescription drugs. And the drugs that were the hardest to come off of, in my opinion, were the psychiatric medications. And I mean worse to come off of than a drug like heroin.
Withdrawal symptoms from the psychiatric drugs just made my mind go crazy.
I couldn't think. I couldn't form coherent thoughts whatsoever.
I was racing. I had highs and lows, ups and downs, hot and cold sweats.
I went through seizures. I was sweating with night sweats so bad I was wetting my bed just with sweat.
I had tremors really bad. I mean, I joked that I looked like I had the end stages of Parkinson's disease. But you couldn't even hold me still when I was going through withdrawals. My legs would shake. I couldn't sleep.
No one in the world should have to go through what I went through, in my opinion. And I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy.
Even newborns born to women taking psychotropics while pregnant can undergo withdrawal. These infants could experience irritability, hyperactivity, abnormal sleep patterns, vomiting, diarrhea, and failure to gain weight. But it is the amplification of certain side effects caused by withdrawal from psychotropics that can have a disastrous effect on the individual.
Now the person stops taking the drug, and the effects of the withdrawal or the effects of stop taking the drug are increased and amplified symptoms like the depression or suicide ideas, or etc.
They have tremendous mood swings. They invariably get violent. And they cannot control their emotions.
You're very depressed, you're suicidal, you're hallucinating, you're psychotic, you're crazy, you're manic when you stop taking your medication.
This is why improper withdrawal from SSRI antidepressants in particular has been shown to trigger mood swings and uncontrollable anger, which have been implicated in many recent killing sprees. In May 1998, for example, 15-year-old Kip Kinkle had just stopped taking Prozac when he shot and killed both his parents, then went on a shooting rampage at his Oregon high school, where he murdered 2 more and wounded 25. In November 2007, Pekka Erik Ovinen shot and killed 8 at his school north of Helsinki, Finland. Earlier that fall, he had either reduced or stopped using the antidepressant he was prescribed for social anxiety. Valentine's Day 2008, Northern Illinois University, Stephen Kazmierczak walked into a crowded lecture hall and opened fire, killing 5 and wounding 18. A few weeks earlier, he too had abruptly stopped taking his antidepressant. But rather than acknowledging that tragedies such as these are the result of withdrawal from highly addictive psychotropic drugs, the customary response of psychiatrists is to blame the lack of the drug for what they claim is the return of the mental illness.
When a psychiatrist says that, well, the reason why they're feeling that way when they get off the drug is because, see, that shows you how bad they really need the drug. Here's the deal. There's no way that that's true.
The reality is, when they stop the drug, they get depressed or they have withdrawal effects of various types. And the reason they're having those effects is because it's a withdrawal effect from the drug.
All you need to do is you need to sit down and listen to anyone who's been on these medications and wants to come off them. And you listen to their story, and you listen to what they're going through, why they want to come off of them. And that's it. The conversation stops. The debate ends.
My name is Robin, and currently I am withdrawing from lorazepam, and I am at the 0.4 milligram dose. There we go. Today, I was totally exhausted. I've had 4 nights, 2 nights of insomnia, and then a good night's sleep, then 2 nights of insomnia. Well, just hoping that I can sleep better tonight. Didn't sleep good last night. Well, as you can see, today I don't care. I did not get ready, and my wave went down. I'm down in the valley today. One of the side effects or withdrawal symptoms for lorazepam can be night sweats or hot flashes, a little lightheaded and kind of dizzy, anxiety, sore throat, weepy, very, very tired, grouchy, just overwhelmed, distraught, distressed. I began to experience suicidal thoughts. I think I've said a little bit to my husband, but he was already worried enough. This is really the first time I'm saying something about it. I feel like I could have a nervous breakdown. You know, there are just times like I hit a brick wall and I can't do it anymore. It's going to take another, maybe 18, 19, 20 weeks to get off of it. And that is very overwhelming to me. I'm weary today. And this is how I used to be for many weeks with lorazepam. And that's the hardest thing, is you are trapped into living it out the way you have to live it out in order to be safe. So that's frustrating. I just want my life back. And that's where I am today.
It took months for Robin to wean herself off just one of her psychiatric drugs. And addiction specialists agree that slowly withdrawing is the only safe way.
You just can't cut people off from these drugs. Sometimes it can take up to a year or more, depending on the person and how long they've been on the drug and how we wean them off.
You can't stop these drugs cold turkey. No. I would never advise anybody to just stop them. They need to be under the care of a medical practitioner.
When some of my patients come in and they talk to me about getting off of psychiatric medications, I really caution them not to just stop their drugs cold turkey, because that can really send them into a tailspin.
The data is right there. It's going to cause the symptoms that it causes. It's going to have withdrawal effects, and they know it. There's not a psychiatrist that doesn't know it.
And yet psychiatrists tell us that psychotropic drugs are the only way to keep people from insanity and alleviate mental distress. But is this really the case? Or are there other choices, effective, inexpensive, and drug-free, that could accomplish all the empty promises left broken and unfulfilled by psychiatry? After all that we have seen, should we believe psychiatrists when they claim that just around the corner is their next new breakthrough? And if psychiatry isn't working, where do we go from here? When we look over the landscape, one question becomes clear. How can anyone trust psychiatrists with their mental health? Even psychiatrists interviewed at a recent convention of the American Psychiatric Association readily admit they have no answers.
What is the answer to mental illness? That's too broad of a question to answer.
I don't think there are any answers to mental illness.
You still need a better answer than the one we have now for mental illness?
I can't even understand the question.
There's no real answer. You can't. These are like chronic problems. You can't just cure somebody.
Since psychiatry has no answers, how do we care for those with very real and severe psychological problems? There are, in fact, many, many answers, but you will never hear about them from psychiatrists who prescribe psychotropic drugs. One solution was the Soteria Project, formed in 1971 by Dr. Lauren Mosher, then head schizophrenia researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health.
Lauren Mosher developed this program, through NIMH to look at this, because they were starting to have in the research a debate about whether the medications were actually being helpful or whether they were actually causing some problems.
They would create a community-based center where people diagnosed with schizophrenia could go. It was going to be non-drug oriented because he didn't believe that psychiatric drugs were the answer to schizophrenia.
It provided a place to where there could be people there who would be supportive and be there during the time they have a crisis. Instead of medicating them, be there with them and help them through it.
And the results were staggering. Soteria residents did significantly better than their peers who were on drugs, with far fewer readmissions. The success of Soteria House proved that understanding and compassion could relieve mental turmoil far better than psychiatric treatment, and without the nasty side effects. But despite this, Dr. Mosher's breakthrough would soon be utterly rejected by a psychiatric community dependent on psychotropic drugs and pharmaceutical money. In Dr. Mosher's 1998 resignation letter to the American Psychiatric Association, he wrote, "Psychiatry has been almost completely bought out by the drug companies. We condone and promote the widespread use and misuse of toxic chemicals that we know have serious long-term effects. Is psychiatry a hoax as practiced today? Unfortunately, the answer is mostly yes."
When people ask me about why aren't there more places to get this type of treatment and why is biopsychiatry kind of taken over, if they were effective, why did they go away? And I really think that it goes back to the question of money.
Between political pressure exerted by the psychiatric establishment and a lack of funding, refuges like Soteria are few and far between. But they can be found, and the truly troubled can and do recover. But what about common, everyday mental or emotional distresses, such as depression or mood swings? Without using psychiatry, how can we treat those? It's easier than one might think, since there is ample evidence that well over half of all psychiatric problems are actually caused by an underlying, undetected physical condition.
I would say nearly 100% of the time when someone comes in wishing to get off of an antidepressant, I find some underlying issues that weren't addressed originally that may have contributed or else caused their mood disorder.
And you start to look at all the different factors in their life, a lot of times you can find that there's multiple different reasons that someone's not feeling well.
Viruses can cause depression. Digestive issues can cause depression and anxiety.
Iron deficiency is very connected to depression.
One of the effects of pesticide poisoning is depression.
Little children, if they get a streptococcal infection, can become obsessive and compulsive.
I've seen people with bipolar disorder, manic depression, who have food allergies.
Pretty much any kind of psychiatric problem can be associated with a low thyroid state.
A ton of difficulties that a person has that can manifest itself as a supposed mental illness, but you fix the hormone, you fix the gland, you fix the nutrition. Miraculously, you can also fix the quote-unquote mental illness.
Why a psychiatrist cannot get to the root of a person's problem, that's the million-dollar question. I have absolutely no idea. They could. They learn it in school. They could just as easily run a blood test as I could run a blood test. They could run all the diagnostic tests I can. They study anatomy, physiology, pathophysiology. They just choose on their own to treat symptoms.
What about others whose psychological problem is not due to an underlying physical problem?
Divorcing parents, a change in babysitters, moving in the middle of a school year. Those can cause disruptions in the normal flow of sitting in a class and paying attention.
Good things are seen as stressful as bad things. Buying a house can be as stressful as losing a house. Getting married can be as stressful as getting divorced. But it may be some situational anxiety, situational depression that would have resolved on its own years ago. And the patient's been on medicine for years.
Well, it is ridiculous to think that normal depression or grief from normal life circumstances should be treated with medication. We didn't think this way before we had them, because people just took it for granted that life was difficult at times. It was stressful, painful, and, difficult emotions, be they anger, pain, sadness, grief. All these things are normal reactions, and to cover that up with medication is really to turn your back on what makes us human beings, which is our emotions.
Of course, serious mental problems do, at times, require the assistance of others. But because of the massive money power of pharmaceutical companies that keeps paid psychiatrists propped up in positions of influence over the public, the media, and the rest of the medical field, the only treatment you will ever hear of is psychotropic drugs. But there is one thing the consumer can do: insist on full and accurate informed consent.
Informed consent boils down to the patient must be told about their diagnosis and what the risks and benefits and alternatives are to the treatment. Risks and benefits and alternatives to the treatment, risks, benefits, and alternatives to not treatment.
So what are the key points of informed consent when it comes to psychotropic drugs? 1. Psychiatric disorders are not actual diseases requiring medical treatment. 2. There is no scientific proof that psychiatric drugs resolve or cure any mental problems. 3. Psychiatric drugs mask symptoms and come with severe short and long-term side effects. 4. Psychiatric drugs can cause dependency and addiction. 5. Most mental problems are caused by an underlying physical illness. 6. No matter how severe the emotional or psychological distress, there are many effective options that do not involve psychiatric drugs. Unfortunately, these points are rarely told to patients.
I have over 2,000 clients, and I can honestly say 100% of them that have come to me, it has either been suggested that they take psychiatric drugs or they actually have taken them. And probably 70 to 80% have actually fallen into the trap and taken the psychiatric drugs because they didn't know what else to do.
50% of patients who are not treated for depression come out of it on their own without any therapy. Okay, that's never on an informed consent, but it is a fact. So, there's never a full informed consent.
But the truth is coming out. 14 U.S. state laws now severely restrict the psychiatric labeling and drugging of children. And a 2004 federal law prohibits school personnel from forcing parents to medicate their sons or daughters with psychotropics. Meanwhile, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has slapped their black box warning label on antidepressants for suicide in children and teenagers, and another warning on stimulants for heart attack, stroke, and sudden death in people of all ages. On another front, psychiatric survivors are now successfully pursuing legal remedies for the crippling effects of psychotropic drugs. Since 2005, there have been 50,000 individual product liability and personal injury lawsuits filed against drug companies for damage caused by psychotropic drugs, an average of 34 suits a day. Eli Lilly, accused of illegally marketing its antipsychotic Zyprexa, has paid out more than $2.5 billion in settlements to 34 states and 31,000 plaintiffs. In 2009, drug maker Pfizer agreed to forfeit over $2.3 billion, in part for colluding with a psychiatric front group to illegally market its antipsychotic, Geodon. Yet with yearly pharmaceutical revenues around $600 billion, drug companies treat judgments and penalties as just a cost of doing business. In fact, billions have been set aside in advance for just that purpose.
The pharmaceutical industry has such a huge financial base that even hundreds of millions of dollars in fines is basically meaningless to them.
Fines for some of these transgressions are like petty cash to the big companies. They're more concerned about the reputation that might be damaged by this. The main thing they do there is just try to hide the fact, and the quickest way to hide the fact is to quickly pay the fine and get out of town.
And this opens the door to enterprising attorneys, but they have to be prepared.
Lawyers need to understand that they do not receive adequate scientific training to conduct these cases by themselves. They need to gather together a team of experts who will help them to do these cases wisely and well. And then other people will begin to see the rates of success that we have had over the last 12 years doing what I call science-intensive litigation.
You have to go to the experts in the field and say, okay, bring your expertise to bear, come to court, and tell people what you know.
I have found that there's an overwhelming number of people that when they see the atrocities that have occurred with psychiatry and the way people have been treated, they are very willing to come over and testify against psychiatry and testify against techniques that are being used.
The court system is just one area where people are speaking out. You too can help by sharing this documentary with coworkers, clients, patients, friends, and loved ones. In doing so, you will answer our final question. What can I do to protect our world from the scourge of psychiatry and psychotropic drugs?